Hello and welcome back. This is the week 3 lecture. So today we'll continue to work with some of these strategies for analysis that we began to cover last week. So if you remember in the last lecture, we talked about surface to depth, patterns, and then contradictions and opposites. I would like to stick with those strategies for at least a little while longer as we look back at some of the poems that I assigned in week 2. We can definitely find examples of all the stuff we talked about last week in the poetry from week 2. So we'll do a little bit of that, but then we can also talk about part to whole, conflict, and change. Those are the new strategies that we are covering this week. So let's go back to those poems. We've already talked about them a little bit, at least on the discussion board, and I did mention them briefly at the end of last week's lecture. So as we know, these are older poems, mostly dating back to the 16 and 1700s. So these are examples of text that students aren't always thrilled to read, and we can be honest about that. It's actually a discussion worth having. And I'm not speaking for everybody, of course. There's always exceptions. Some people really like to read poetry, write poetry, be immersed in poetry. But typically speaking, if we are sort of speaking in generalities, we can say that the majority of people, and this is true of the general public and English students, I would say, the majority of people typically prefer to read prose over poetry. So when we say prose, of course, you guys know that means short stories, novels, but virtually everything is written in prose. You know, newspaper articles, nonfiction, instructional material. Prose is almost always going to be easier to read and understand. That's why it's the more commonly used type of writing. Verse or poetry tends to be a little bit more abstract, often a little bit less narrative in nature, which can sometimes make it a little bit more difficult to read, follow, and understand. So again, speaking generally, we can say that more people prefer prose and more people read prose. And that's true even if we narrow our focus to just English students. Even if we took a poll of undergrads, graduate students, even some professionals working in the field, many would probably agree that prose gets studied nowadays a little bit more, gets taught a little bit more. It's just easier to work with, although that's not to say that plenty of people are not still producing poetry and also writing about it, analyzing it, studying it, what have you. So there are a few obstacles that might present themselves when we tackle poetry, especially old poetry like what we read back in week 2. So I just wanted to say a brief word about that before we jumped into our text today. Just, I don't know, a word of encouragement for anybody who might not feel as confident analyzing poetry as they do analyzing prose. And again, some of the reasons for this distinction between the two types of writing, are some of those distinctions are worth keeping in mind. And some of the reasons why a lot of people prefer prose might be worth keeping in mind as we embark on poetry reading. I mean, going back to prose, and some of these differences, again, prose tends to be associated with narrative. It's not always going to be the case, but typically prose is the best delivery vehicle for a narrative, a story. So if we're reading a short story or a novel or even a news article, we expect to find certain narrative elements because we are getting a story and we are meant to follow and understand that story. So we're going to expect to find characters, different settings, some kind of a plot that we can follow. There'll be big narrative events. There'll be certain types of conflict. There might be a climax, sort of that peak moment of the narrative action, some kind of a resolution. We've all sort of learned our plot triangles by now. So we expect certain narrative elements like those. Again, not just in fiction, But really, in any kind of prose, even if it's nonfiction, oftentimes it's still delivering a story or it's still attempting to explain something to us. So we're going to find a lot of narrative elements because people tend to learn best when things can be presented, at least in some shape or form, as a narrative. So that's fine. That's a big reason why, again, prose might be a little bit more popular, because poetry tends to be more abstract, a little bit less straightforward, less direct, and we don't always associate poetry with sort of unfolding a narrative, though it is important to note that there are narrative poems. There's plenty of examples of narrative poetry. We could look at some of those. We're not reading really any great examples this week. Typically, lyric poetry is more popular. You guys have probably already learned that before. I mean, we can find examples of narrative poetry, and if we go back to sort of the origins of literature in the Western tradition, we can look at epic poetry from ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and, in many ways, those have a lot in common with novels, but they are written in verse. They are long narrative poems. So of course we could find more modern examples too, but a lot of the poetry that we read, a lot of the poetry that we study will typically be what's called lyric poetry. As you guys probably know, lyric poetry tends to be shorter and it's often not narrative in nature. There are exceptions, but typically a lyric poem is not so focused on telling a story, but rather it's really working towards expressing certain feelings, certain emotions, certain images, certain sensations or experiences. A lot of times lyric poems might be thought of as kind of impressionistic, sort of providing a series of images or, sensory impressions of some kind. Often, again, a little bit more abstract, a little bit more about ideas. They feature poetic language, which is often defined as being very heavy in imagery, symbolism, and figurative language. Not to say that we wouldn't find those things in prose. We often do. But we're going to find it in even larger volumes with even more frequency in poetry. So again, a lot of poems will sort of exist beyond that literal level, on a more figurative level, perhaps a more symbolic or metaphorical level. They're not delivering a story so much as images or feelings or certain kinds of experiences, certain kinds of ideas. But there's usually going to be thematic material that we can identify, and we can perform analysis on these poems in much the same way that we would analyze prose. So as we've already seen, a lot of our most common literary elements show up in poetry, prose fiction, drama, plays, whatever it is we're reading. We can always find some imagery, some metaphors, and some poems will have characters and settings, some of those more typical narrative elements that we might be able to dig into. So we can observe similarities between prose and verse, but we should also be aware of some of the key distinctions and some of the things that makes verse different. And makes verse distinctive. It's a distinctive reading experience, and it does require a little bit of just a few different moves as we are performing our analysis. So today I will talk about a few things that are specifically related to the sound and rhythm of poetry. Stuff like meter, rhyme scheme, stanzas. I don't want to spend too much time on review. A lot of you took one of my 203 classes in the past, so we talked about a lot of this stuff in 203, and hopefully you've gotten some basic understanding of poetic form and some of the structures and patterns that go into a lot of traditional poetry. As I mentioned in the week 2 discussion board, a lot of contemporary poetry is written in what's called free verse, sometimes called open form, which means it doesn't necessarily have meter or rhyme or a lot of these traditional aspects of structure and form that we find in older poetry, like the stuff that we read back in week 2. So we can prefer the contemporary style, certainly, but it's good to have an appreciation for certain aspects of poetic form. And I want to start by going back to patterns. I want to start there today, and let's take a look at some of these poems and just look for patterns. A lot of the patterns that we find will be connected to these text poetic forms, their structures, the forms that they are governed by, the forms or structures that they are adhering to. We have more freedom now, typically, when we write poetry, but even today, even in the modern age, we have a lot of poets who like to play with old poetic forms, experiment with them, change them in some cases. They might be working within them while also changing them in interesting ways. So I don't want to get into too much review, but you guys do need to have sort of a basic understanding of meter, rhyme, and stanza. If you have notes from an old class, or if you want to do a little research into those terms, you might want to, and you might want to put that material into your notes, because by this point, in 325, we sort of expect this stuff to be pretty familiar to students because you've been exposed to it by now, hopefully in more than one class. But just as a reminder, think of meter as the principal organizing structure of individual lines within a poem. So really, the meter is sort of responsible for arranging the lines, the way the lines look, the way they sound, and often the way they work together within the larger text. All of that will often be governed by meter. And meter is also going to have a big influence on the rhythm and just the overall sort of sound and texture of a poem. So we can detect the meter at work in some of the poems that we read back in week 2. So if we start with sonnet number 18 by William Shakespeare, we're going to notice a few sort of classic aspects of traditional poetic form. And I just want to talk about these a little bit. We don't need to become experts in meter. That would, make us prosodists. Prosody is the study of meter. We don't need to get that far into it, although maybe one day some of us will. We just need to know a little bit about these things, and we're going to notice how poetry, of course, changes over the course of the semester as we move towards more free verse, open form poetry. But here in the 16 and 1700s, most of our poems adhere to a certain structure or form, so they're often called closed form poetry. So a sonnet is an example. Back then, in Shakespeare's era, if you were going to write a sonnet, you needed to follow certain rules. And in fact, Shakespeare wrote so many sonnets that he actually kind of codified and standardized a lot of rules that we still have today when it comes to a sonnet. So there are other kinds of sonnets, but we typically refer to the Shakespearean sonnet. And of course, we have a prime example here. So there are certain rules that you typically would have followed if you were going to write a Shakespearean sonnet. And these are all aspects of poetic form. And you're going to notice that a lot of these will also function as patterns, as they provide a structure to the overall text. So let's start with the total number of lines. A Shakespearean sonnet traditionally would have 14 lines total. So if you take a look at the example, you'll notice that's in effect here. So we have 14 lines. Let's break that down into individual stanzas. We know that stanzas are kind of like paragraphs in a poem. Okay, so stanzas are collections of lines, much like a paragraph in prose fiction. So this is a very important unit of organization that we sort of need to understand a little bit. So in a Shakespearean sonnet, we start with 3 quatrains. A quatrain is simply a 4-line stanza. Okay, so we have 3 4-line stanzas, and then at the very end, we have a closing couplet. This is a heroic couplet, which means just a pair of lines that kind of go together at the very end. So we can do some simple math here, right? 4, 8, 12, and then the final 2 lines, we end up at 14 total. So we're supposed to have certain kinds of stanzas, 3 4-line stanzas, and then a closing couplet, 2 lines together at the end. So this is all part of the form. We also have a particular rhyme scheme here that you can detect probably if you're paying attention, if you're reading. Again, this is going to be true of any Shakespearean sonnet. We go A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, and then G, G. So we have in rhyme throughout the poem. So the rhyme will usually occur at the end of lines. That's typical. That's what we generally see the most of in English language poetry, but you guys probably know there's also such a thing as internal rhyme, which can often be created by assonance or alliteration. We can sometimes find rhyme in the middle of lines. Doesn't have to be in rhyme, but we see in rhyme here. And we notice that we have in rhyme, and then within those quatrains, every other line rhymes, right? A, B, C, D, C, D. That's how those first three stanzas work. Okay, we have in rhyme, and every other line rhymes. And that stays consistent all the way until the end. But at the end, with that closing heroic couplet, we get a different kind of rhyme. Now we have those final two lines rhyming together, right? So we're no longer in that sort of alternating pattern. We change it up at the end. So it goes A, B, C, D, E, F, and then G, G. That's how couplets typically work. Couplets are rhyming pairs of lines that go together, and they will often conclude things. They will often come at the end of a poem. So that's what we see in the classic Shakespearean sonnet. And the final bit of important poetic form here is that these poems need to be written in iambic pentameter. That is the meter. So let's go back to meter. We know that it's how we sort of organize individual lines, and you guys should be familiar with a few different types of metrical feet. So the most basic sort of element or component of meter are individual syllables. That's the most basic unit of meter. So in the English language poetic tradition, almost all of our metrical feet, different kinds of meter, they almost all consist of two syllables. So that makes it kind of easy to keep them straight. And again, we don't need to know every kind of meter. We just need to know some of the most common type. And the most common type of metrical foot in English language poetry is the iamb. So we might be familiar with iambic pentameter because Shakespeare often uses it, but it's used quite a bit in a lot of English language poetry. So we see it a lot. And an iamb is a particular type of metrical foot consisting of two syllables, unstressed, followed by stressed. So that's a thing to remember. You probably know with syllables, we're usually alternating stressed to stressed, unstressed to stressed, or stressed to unstressed. So in the case of an iamb, that's a metrical foot. One metrical foot consists of two syllables. And if it's an iamb, we're going unstressed to stressed. Okay, that's an iamb. Two syllables, unstressed to stressed. That's the most common metrical foot in English language poetry, but we're also going to encounter the trochee, and the trochee is just the inverse of the iamb. So like the iamb, it consists of two syllables, but it's just the reverse. It's the opposite of the iamb. So with the trochee, we go stressed to unstressed, whereas the iamb, we go unstressed to stressed. So an important difference, but not totally different. And we can also find a spondee. That's another type of metrical foot that consists of two syllables, but a spondee's weird because both of those syllables will be stressed. We go stressed to stressed. But again, we almost always will have two syllables in every kind of metrical foot that we find in English. So you can kind of figure out stressed and unstressed, sometimes based on vowel sounds. Just keep in mind that in English, long vowel sounds are typically stressed, and short vowel sounds will typically be unstressed. But of course, there's no shame in looking this stuff up. We don't always necessarily have to identify the meter ourselves, but we should know the meter. of any poem that we are reading. If we have to look it up, if we have to consult the critics or the scholars, that's fine. But once you figure it out, you should always go back and read the poem again, understanding, what syllables you're supposed to be stressing, understanding what kind of metrical foot you're looking at, so then you can gain a greater appreciation of the poem. Okay, so those are just some basic things. And again, we should know a little bit about rhyme scheme. We know that in rhyme is the most common kind of rhyme. And we also know that, of course, not all poems have to have a rhyme scheme, but Shakespearean sonnets do. So if we look at this particular type of traditional poetic form, the sonnet, a very particular type of poem, there are a lot of different rules governing different parts of the poem. So we have a rule governing the meter. It has to be iambic pentameter. Oh yeah, I've kind of forgot the point. We've discussed the iamb, but pentameter refers to how many of those iambs we have per line. So we also have to figure that out. Once we've decided if we're using iambs or trochees or spondees, we really need to know how many of them we have per line. So we have to figure out the number. Do we just have one iamb per line? That would be monometer, just one metrical foot per line. Do we have two of them? That would be dimeter. Do we have three of them? That would be trimeter. Four would be tetrameter. Keep that one in mind. 5 would be pentameter, and so forth and so on. You get the picture. So iambic pentameter means that we have 5 iambs per line, for a total of 10 syllables per line. And again, we're following that unstressed to stressed pattern. So you can kind of do this just based on counting syllables. If you can determine that we have 10 syllables per line, there's a good chance we're dealing with iambic pentameter, because again, that's very common. So identify the iamb, then figure out how many iambs there are, and that will kind of complete the picture as far as meter. So going back to the Shakespearean sonnet, we have a rule governing meter, okay? We have a rule governing rhyme scheme, and we notice that change in rhyme scheme at the very end. We have a rule governing stanzas, right? We have to have certain numbers of lines in each one of these stanzas. So these are all aspects of form, but many of them also create patterns. They create patterns that we can observe, of course, but not only that, the patterns also have larger meaning. So the meter creates a pattern. The rhyme scheme creates a pattern. The organization of the stanzas creates a pattern, not just visually, but there's even sort of a kind of progression that's supposed to occur in a Shakespearean sonnet, as the those first three quatrains kind of introduce ideas or problems that will get resolved by the time we get down to that closing couplet. So sometimes stanza organization will be largely a visual pattern. And we see examples of that a lot with contemporary poetry, where the visual look of the lines and stanzas on the page is actually very important and might have, a big stake in the overall meaning. So there's that part, but then also like thematically, or even in some cases narratively, the stanzaic organization will kind of dictate how things are revealed to the reader, or how an argument is made, or how certain things, are kind of unfolded. So it's a lot of layers to this that we could definitely dig into. We could focus largely on stanzas, or we could focus our pattern attention on rhyme scheme or meter. We would have a lot to say about any of those things, but those are obviously patterns, and a lot of those patterns come from the sonnet form, like the actual poetic form that's governing this particular text. So let's just keep that in mind. That's always a place we can go when it comes to patterns. We can always think about, especially if it's older poetry, that is subscribing to some kind of closed form, an established kind of poem that has to be formatted and written a certain way. So again, sonnets had certain rules, odes had different rules, elegies might have had slightly different rules, and then other forms like sestinas or villanelles. A lot of these actually come from outside the English tradition. So these are all different kinds of poems with different kinds of meters, different kinds of stanzas, different kinds of rhyme schemes. And traditionally, a lot of poets would have worked within those closed, already established forms. But again, we know that today, a lot of people don't necessarily follow a lot of those aspects of structure. But later in the semester, when we get to more free verse contemporary poetry, we're still going to be able to find patterns. We're still going to be able to find things that give those poems a structure, that give them a rhythm. Because even free verse poetry is different than prose. It's still more impressionistic. It's still more abstract. It's still more steeped in poetic language. And it's still going to have maybe a trace of a meter or a little bit of rhyme, or there will be some kind of organizational principle at work in the stanzas. So there will be some of this stuff still evident even when we turn to a lot more contemporary poetry. All right, so that's a good place to start with patterns, but let's move on with Sonnet 18 and talk about some of those other strategies that we were covering last week. So I want to talk about opposites just for a moment, because I think there's something interesting going on here, kind of an opposite at work, or sort of our expectations are getting a little bit upset perhaps. Because we have this idea here, if we follow the entire poem, this idea that summers will end. Summers are nice, of course, pleasant, beautiful, although they have some drawbacks, as our speaker points out. But ultimately, summers will end. No matter how great they are, they will always come to an end. But the speaker is saying that, he's immortalizing his lover through the act of writing this poem. So unlike a summer, which will always come to an end, his lover will live forever because he has described her and talked about her in this poem. It's a bit of a bold proclamation. Some people might perceive it as a bit arrogant. The poet is basically saying, hey, I'm keeping your memory alive forever by writing this poem. So in that way, I am elevating you sort of above and beyond a typical beautiful summer's day. So this might not be quite what we expect when the poem begins. If we're not familiar with the text, we might start by sort of expecting a different kind of comparison. We might expect our speaker here to compare based more on likeness, based more on the shared sort of traits that his lover has with a summer day. Like, how are they similar, right? This is a very conventional move that poets or speakers will often make when comparing a lover, to something beautiful, right? I'm going to compare you to a summer's day or a flower or some other beauty maybe found in nature, right? This is a very common sort of conventional comparison that we see in a lot of poetry, comparing human beauty to the beauty found in nature. Very conventional move. So that might be what we expect here. But that's actually not quite what the speaker is doing. At least he's not structuring his comparison in sort of a conventional way. He's not talking about all of the ways that his lover is like a summer's day. Instead, he's showing all of the ways that his lover outshines a summer's day. So he points out some of the drawbacks to summer days. And he also points out the finite nature of summer days, whereas his lover is going to be immortalized through art. So that's maybe not quite the comparison that we expect at the very beginning. It's not quite a conventional lovers comparison. He's doing something a little bit different, though he's still arriving at a fairly, conventional conclusion, sort of lionizing and idolizing the subject of his affection. But again, notice the move he makes at the end. Notice what he's really getting at, sort of a larger statement about art and what art does, how art can sort of create a record that may never go away. It's in a way sort of keep people or things alive. So it's an interesting statement, and that brings us to surface to depth. Because if we stay on the surface level of this poem, it won't take us very long to summarize it or describe it. We can say that we have a speaker here, the poetic version of a narrator. We have a speaker comparing his lover to a summer's day. That is literally what's happening in the poem. The surface level reading of a poem might be a little different than the surface level reading of a short story because, again, there's often not much of a plot to reconstruct if we're reading poetry. So it's not so much, reconnecting all of the events of the plot like we did with The Thing Around Your Neck last week, but rather just sort of, okay, this is what the speaker is talking about. Here are the images that are being sort of provided or the statements that are being made. Here's what is literally happening or being said. And what is being said here, again, what is happening is basically a comparison. So that would be our surface level reading, and that doesn't get us very far. That does not tell us very much. But if we push deeper, if we get more in depth, we're going to notice again that there's actually kind of an interesting theme here that might not have a ton to do with the lover that our speaker is describing. And again, we might just assume that we're once again connecting the beauty of a person to the beauty found in nature. We could argue that's happening, but at the very least, that's not all that's happening. And I would argue that that's not always necessarily what's happening at all. Instead, our speaker is making a larger point, again, about how art can sort of create immortality. So some critics have made the case that really this poem is sort of more about the speaker than it is about the subject of his praise and love. It's really more about him and the power that he wields as the poet, as the artist, as the creator. He's making her live forever. He is enshrining her beauty in the halls of memory and history. So beautiful nature, that might fade. A summer's day, some scenic vista, that stuff might not last forever. But art does something different, maybe something better. And that seems to be what he's telling us by the time we get to that closing couplet. So kind of an interesting theme, and maybe not exactly what we would expect when we first started thinking about love poetry, sort of conventional moves that we might expect to find in a sonnet that's obviously about love and comparing the object of his affection to other beautiful things. So those are some other ways that we can employ those strategies to get us moving on potential analysis. But remember, we can also get into individual similes, metaphors, images, maybe particular symbols that we find within the poem, and then we can just run with those. Maybe some of those register as patterns. Maybe some of those serve to express interesting opposites or contradictions, or they might just get us a more in-depth reading. But we can always grab a few key elements and just kind of run with them. What are they doing? What do they express? Why are they interesting? That's often a big part of the work. But to give us a little bit more of a framework, we can plug some of those individual observations, some of those individual elements that we're looking at, we can plug them in to some of these larger networks, maybe by thinking about stuff like patterns or like opposites and surface to depth. Okay, so let's move on to another poem now, Eve's Apology in Defense of Women. So this is another really interesting one where we can detect a lot of patterns that are based on poetic form here. But also we can notice some key repetition. The second person pronoun is repeated quite a bit in this poem. So this might remind us a little bit of Adichie's short story that we read last week. Or I guess 2 weeks ago by this point. So we get the repetition of the words you and your. So notice that will have an impact on us. Also, we can notice a very specific pattern that's based on stanzas here. So we have a very particular type of stanza being used in this poem, and it's called ottava rima. This was originally an Italian form of rhyming stanza that was later kind of adapted to English language poetry. So this is an 8-line stanza that does feature a rhyme scheme. But the final 2 lines of that 8-line stanza will consist of one of these heroic couplets that we've already been talking about. So we have 8-line stanzas, but the final 2 lines will be rhyming couplets. Okay? So that's the sort of governing form here that we see in this particular poem. So again, this is a particular kind of stanza, ottava rima. Originally Italian, later adapted to English. So we're going to find 8-line stanzas, and the lines tend to be iambic. Okay, so once again, we are dealing with iambs. Typically iambic pentameter will be the case, and we can sort of track that throughout the poem. We can also see a consistent rhyme scheme within each one of these stanzas. So any one of these ottava rimas will consist of this following rhyme scheme: A, B, A, B, A, B, C, C. Okay, so that's going to be the pattern. Once again, that's a repeated pattern that we can follow throughout the poem. We once again have in rhyme, every other line rhymes until we get to those closing heroic couplets and they rhyme together. So a lot of this stuff is, be a little bit familiar to what we just saw with Shakespeare's sonnet. Again, we have iambic pentameter, but now we have a different type of stanza. And we also have very different subject matters. So one cool thing about this type of stanza that we see here is that it allows for a very particular sort of argumentative structure. And if you're paying attention to this poem, you should notice that we have an argument here. It's almost like the speaker of the poem is sort of performing like a lawyer, presenting a case in court. And if you break down the individual stanzas, you'll notice that the first 6 lines of these stanzas tend to formulate a particular argument. And then the final 2 lines of the stanza, those heroic couplets, they're kind of more like direct addresses. Almost like the speaker is directly addressing the audience, or maybe a jury, if we stay with that sort of courtroom metaphor. So again, that's a structure governed by the stanzas and by how many lines are found within each stanza. So again, the first 6 lines kind of make an argument, and then the final 2 lines sort of drive that argument home in the form of a more direct address, where often this basic idea is driven home that men are more at fault than women for all of these, sort of biblical occurrences, but also sort of these larger problems, because again, there's sort of a surface reading, and then there's that deeper level that we're about to get to. So again, the stanza's it's about more than just how many lines are in each stanza. It also governs meaning to a certain extent, because by working with that ottava rima structure, we're able to create a very specific kind of argumentative structure. And again, that's a pattern that you could detect. That's a pattern that you could do something with as you sort of follow it throughout the text. So if we think about opposites or contradictions, I think there's one obvious one here when we consider the time period in which the poem was written. Just the argument itself, the larger points that are being made, obviously fly in the face of what would have been conventional wisdom back then. So women were often blamed for many things. And of course, when we go back to the Bible, Eve was blamed. So we're going against conventional wisdom here. We're getting an alternative perspective or viewpoint that would not have been the majority perspective at the time. It would not have been the sort of socially endorsed, accepted, version of events. So that makes the poem interesting, a little bit subversive, because, our speaker is cutting against conventional wisdom and presenting an argument that really is in opposition to the sort of dominant way of thinking at the time. And then if we move to surface depth, again, starting on the surface level, we can say, okay, the speaker is defending Eve almost as if we're in a courtroom. That's kind of the literal, basic, surface level reading. But if we push deeper, I think we'll see that there's a larger message here. It's not just about these biblical episodes. It's not just about Eve, right? And it's not just about those moments in the past. A lot of critics and scholars read this poem as very much a challenge to the patriarchy of 17th century, Europe. Sort of a challenge to the power structures that dominated during that time. So the surface level gets us some idea, sure, of what's going on, but it doesn't tap into the full thematic material, because the larger message or meaning of the poem goes beyond just Eve, goes beyond the Bible, and it's really about what was then contemporary gender relations, and it could again be expanded even further beyond that. So that's often what we're going to encounter, right? If we get deeper, we'll arrive at deeper, more important meanings that go beyond just sort of the literal on the surface. Okay, so to just kind of conclude, we're not going to cover everything, but let's go quickly through the Blake poems, The Lamb and the Tiger, just to finish our project here. Again, looking for patterns first. We're going to notice that certain words get repeated. In these two sister poems, we should notice that they very much go together. They're sort of representing polar opposites in a way. We should notice that. But what we're getting with these two works, really, obviously both written by William Blake, they're expressing similar ideas, but from different perspectives. So keep that in mind. But other patterns that we can find, okay, repetition of certain words. Look for that. Repeated word choice. Also, alliteration. The repetition of certain vowel sounds. In other cases, in other poems, we might notice assonance. That's the repetition of certain consonant sounds. Those often create patterns. So we can find alliteration, particularly with Blake, with frequent repetition. Again, we also get some rhyming couplets, which in the case of the Lamb, we get rhyming couplets in the Lamb. We get a lot of repetition in the Lamb, and the effect that's created by that stuff, and a lot of you pointed this out on the discussion board, it sounds like a song. It sounds like a lullaby. Something that you might sing to a child to help them fall asleep. So this makes it easy to read. That creates a very obvious structure, rhythm, pattern that we can follow. We might find it pleasing to the ear. A lot of poetry is pleasing to the ear if we are focusing on some of these elements of sound. So we notice all of that. We kind of feel like it's a song or a lullaby, at least with that first stanza. But then we might notice that in the second stanza, we get a different rhyme scheme. So try to track that. The rhyme scheme changes from the first to the second stanza. So that can be a little bit jarring. It's a little bit of a shift. See if you can observe that. So those are some things we could talk about in relation to form, structure, and some of those patterns that they provide. If we look over at the Tiger, it follows a more specific, consistent poetic form. So we have 6 stanzas, each with 4 lines. So once again, these are quatrains. That's just a term for a 4-line stanza, like what we saw with Shakespeare. But now we get 6 of them. Okay, so we get 6 4-line stanzas, and our meter here, for the most part, is trochaic tetrameter. Okay, so I mentioned the trochee earlier, another common type of English language metrical foot. That's just the opposite of the iamb. So the trochee goes stressed to unstressed, but again, it's just 2 syllables. Okay, so for the most part in this poem, each line will consist of trochees, 4 trochees per line for a total of 8 syllables following that rhythm or that pattern of stressed to unstressed. So that's mostly what we see. But if we're being a little bit more precise, and you guys don't typically have to do this, but I just want to give you the full picture. If we're being precise, and you might notice this if you're counting up syllables in the tiger, this is actually, to be more exact, trochaic, tetrameter, catalectic. Catalectic meaning that we have metrically incomplete lines. We're actually missing a syllable at the end of a lot of our lines in the tiger. So instead of ending up with 8 syllables like we should if we're sticking to trochaic tetrameter, because again, if we have 4 trochees, and we know that each trochee consists of 2 syllables, that should be, 4 times 2 equals 8. We should have 8 syllables per line. But if you're doing some counting, you'll notice that a lot of the lines in the tiger actually only have 7 syllables. So a lot of those lines are metrically incomplete. Some of them do have 8 syllables and some don't. And just to be a little bit more confusing, there's also, I think, a few lines that are actually in iambic tetrameter. So sometimes he'll switch the metrical foot, and instead of using trochees, he'll use iambs. He only does that maybe in a couple of lines. And still, we'll have 4 iambs, just like we had 4 trochees, or at least close to that. So we should have 8 syllables, but we'll often only have 7. We don't always have to get that far into the weeds, but you should at least be somewhat aware, of meter, especially when meter changes, because sometimes that can be an important change to track. But again, the tiger is more tightly constructed in a certain way. It has a tighter, more consistent poetic form. The lamb has form too, and a lot of patterns that are built in based on alliteration and repetition. But we can track the meter a little bit more easily in the tiger. But we can also notice a lot of the same stuff, repetition, rhyme, and we can see how those things are having an effect on readers, right? What do those things do? How do they affect us? How do they help to express meaning? Okay, if we go to opposites and contradictions, obviously the lamb and the tiger, just as animals, they're kind of opposite. They're different. They represent sort of polar opposite things. So we might think about sort of innocence being represented on one side and then maybe something more dangerous or menacing on the other. Sometimes this is described as good versus evil, although for what it's worth, that's not how Blake would have put it. As somebody who had to read some of Blake's philosophy, I can say, and a lot of his poetry, he didn't quite believe in that sort of simplistic good versus evil binary. He often described it more as innocence versus experience, if that makes any sense. But clearly, the lamb and the tiger have really important symbolic value. Right? They obviously represent more than just the animals. So if we're thinking about surface and depth, okay, on the surface level, we are contrasting. If we're looking at both poems, the sister poems, we're, on the surface level, we're contrasting 2 animals that are different. Okay, that have different traits, different personalities. Sure, but to get at the real meaning, to get more in depth, we would really need to think about what these animals symbolize. What does the lamb represent? And of course, there's a lot in our culture, there's a lot in the Judeo-Christian sort of tradition that could clue us in to some possible larger meanings of the lamb, what the lamb might mean or represent. And also, what does the tiger symbolize? What does the tiger represent? So we have to get at that deeper symbolic or metaphorical level. To fully understand what the poem's doing. So we can use all of those strategies from last week. We can search for patterns. We can search for opposites or contradictions. We can search for a more in-depth reading that pushes beyond the surface, but really we should always be doing that anyway, especially when we read poetry. Because a surface level reading of a poem will not get us very much. Like we said last week, if we're reading a short story, or a novel, any kind of prose fiction, that surface level reading will at least just tell us what happened. We'll at least be able to do some plot summary. But with lyric poetry, when we often don't have plots to reconstruct, that surface level reading will just give us the most obvious, the most literal meaning, and we really always have to go beyond that. But again, don't be afraid to dig into stuff like rhyme and meter. I know just from past experience, a lot of students don't want to, at least go very in depth. They might mention what the meter is or the rhyme scheme. Again, that's always stuff you can potentially look up and find out if you're interested. But I would like you guys to tell me what the meter does. Like, what is the effect? What is the larger significance? What does it do for the reader? What does it do for the larger themes at work? Try to arrive at conclusions like that are more geared towards those types of things, as opposed to just making statements like the poet is using this type of meter or this type of rhyme scheme. It's great to make those observations, but then the next step is to do something with them. And you can always just grab a single line from a poem and just kind of break it down, count up the syllables, figure out what kind of metrical foot is being used, how many of those metrical feet are in the line, and just do a little analysis of your own. If you get stumped, you can always consult other sources. But I would just, take one line from the Tiger, like the third line from the third stanza. And when thy heart began to beat. Okay, just take that line, break it down, see how it works in terms of meter, and then you can start looking at individual stanzas and maybe think about how those stanzas are working. It's good to get granular. It's good to get down to the most fundamental building blocks of whatever it is we're looking at. So with a poem, that means syllables, meter, rhyme scheme, and other things too, stanzas, but then other things, those other, aspects of poetic language that we've already been mentioning. Look for imagery, look for metaphors, look for similes, personification, maybe allusions with an A, not allusions with an I. We're not talking about mirages, things that aren't really there, but really rather allusions with an A, which just means a reference to something outside of the text, something outside that textual universe that we are existing in as we read, a reference to a character, a real life person, an event that took place outside of the poem, outside of the short story, but it has some relevance. A comparison is being made. An idea is being planted. There's some reason for that allusion. So again, like other kinds of figurative language, allusions give us a chance to move kind of above or beyond the literal. We get to some deeper meanings. We get to some meanings that kind of transcend everyday reality. Deeper symbolic or metaphorical meanings that might unlock important thematic material. So we can always do that stuff. So I think that's enough on the week 2 poems and all of the strategies that we've covered before. Let's talk briefly about a couple of new strategies, but really we'll hold off on using these until next week. So in next week's lecture, I'll talk about the week 3 readings. So in week 3, we go back to short stories. So the short stories that we read will give us an opportunity to talk about conflict, change, and I also want to mention part to whole, because part to whole is really just a foundational concept for analysis in general. So I'll say a few things about it because it's going to be sort of a pursuit of ours really throughout the semester. Some people would argue that the part to whole method, which is really not unique to literary analysis, it's just sort of a basic tenet of analysis in general, doesn't really matter what you're analyzing. But many would say that part to whole is really just analysis. Like, it's just how analysis works. You don't have to give it that special title or label, but essentially what it refers to is just taking individual parts. And when we're reading literature, we know the individual parts are literary elements like characters, like imagery, like metaphors, but also patterns, contradictions, tropes. Please review that little handout I posted of literary terms and elements. I included some stuff that we talked about a little bit last week. A lot of those terms and elements will be familiar. They'll be review, but those are all things that you can look for. Those are all things that you can talk about and explore in the course of an analysis. So we take those individual parts and then we see how they work. How they work individually, but also how they work with other parts, how they work together with other elements, other parts, and how they ultimately contribute to the whole. So this really is how analysis works. Analysis is the process of breaking something down into its individual parts in order to understand how everything works. And then using our newfound knowledge, we can literally, if we're working with a car engine, or figuratively, if we're working with a poem, we can put all of those parts, all of those individual elements back together in order to see how the whole thing functions, right? That's analysis. That is what we are trying to accomplish with any type of analysis. So that's what we're doing here. And we probably already know that. But it's just a reminder that observing is not enough. Okay? Observing what meter Blake is using, that's not enough. Identifying a rhyme scheme, identifying a different pattern, some other kind of repetition, it's not enough if you're just making a general statement about it. If you're just pointing it out, that's not enough when it comes to analysis. Now, that's a good part of the early stages, right? When we are responding, when we're having our emotional responses, when we maybe are doing a little bit of summary, making sure we understand the text. At that point, observation is great. Observation can be a big part of what we're doing in our reading journals and on our discussion posts. We can observe, we can talk about our feelings, what we liked, what we didn't like. We can try a few new ideas on for size. That's all kind of the early experimental stage. We're still figuring it out, putting down our impressions, our thoughts, our observations. That's early. That's early. And then we make the transition from responding and observing to analyzing. And when we're analyzing, we're arriving at original conclusions about those elements, about those individual parts. So there needs to be a bigger picture. It can't just be, oh, this is a cool meter. It sounds good. Okay, there's got to be more. Either connect it to the theme, tell us something new about that meter, tell us something about the effect it has on readers, or again, connect it to larger meaning, part of the larger message or the larger thematic material at work. You always have to do something with those observations, connect them, expound on them, tell us why they're important, and arrive at original conclusions about them. That's how you can make that transition from responding and observing to analyzing and making arguments. And that's obviously an important transition to make. So part to whole is going to be with us throughout the semester. It's just a good principle, a good concept to keep in mind. But just one final thing before we go to get us ready for next week. So something to think about really throughout this week as you're reading the short stories I've assigned for week 3. Let's think about 2 C's, conflict and change. We know what these words mean, right? We know conflict. We know that often when we are reading narrative, prose fiction, often, short stories, novels, we're going to find conflict. Conflict often drives a lot of the narrative action that we find. So there can be all sorts of different conflict, person versus person, person versus nature. We know these, person versus society. There's all kinds of permutations. But let's start really thinking about conflict, the kinds of conflict that we find in these texts. How do these conflicts develop? What do these conflicts say? What do they suggest about the characters, about the settings, about themes, about anything else that we want to consider? And just watch how the conflict drives action, how it shapes characterization, and how it creates impressions and emotional responses within us. And then finally, change. Let's track any important change that we notice in the text that we read. What change occurs? Do people change? Do situations change? Do objects change? Or maybe do we see more abstract things changing? Do ideas change? Minds change? What do these changes mean? What do the changes do? What might the changes represent? Again, can we tie them to larger thematic material? All right, so enjoy the short stories in week 3, and then we'll come back in week 4, talk about conflict, change, use a few additional strategies as we return to short stories. Let me know if you have any questions, if there's anything so far that is not clicking, or if you're having trouble accessing any of our info. Just let me know, reach out, we can always talk more.